Hey everyone, welcome to this next installment on Anna's Day of Conversation. I am Kristen Portland, Anna's Executive Director, and I am joined today by Heather Caplan from the Lane 9 Project. And since there's never actually enough time to talk, Heather, I want to jump right into it and ask you to tell us just a little bit about Lane 9 and you and what you do over there.
Yeah, I would love to. Thanks for having us. We're so glad to be here helping out during Eating Disorder Awareness Week. We are focused on improving the menstrual health of female athletes, especially those who are struggling with REDS. And we do that by providing workshops for teams and coaches. We provide resources for athletes. We do a lot of storytelling, which I know we'll touch on here in a little bit, sharing athlete stories through our platforms and our podcast. And we also connect athletes with clinicians and coaches through our directory that we've built out. Our clinicians and coaches specialize in women's health and sport. So we want to make sure that it's really easy for athletes who are struggling to find someone to work with and to build their care team. How Lane 9 came to be was really through shared lived experiences between myself and my co-founder, Alexis Fairbanks. We met in DC in 2016. She was working on a project about REDS and found me through my private practice at the time. My background is in dietetics, and I was primarily working with active women who were experiencing hypothalamic amenorrhea, which is one component of REDS. And it's secondary amenorrhea. It's when a menstruating person loses their period, often due to overexercise or undereating, and or the combination of the two. So that was my specialty in private practice. And we got to talking and eventually got to the part of the conversation where it's like, why are you interested in this? And for both of us, it was having experienced it ourselves and wanting to know more about it and wanting to support folks who were going through it. And then we just kind of kept talking and kept coming back to this question of what is something that we could do about this that could help fellow athletes and fellow active women in sports who are struggling and maybe don't know what's going on or don't know that it's okay to ask for help and don't know where to find that help. So we built out Lane 9, not really knowing exactly what we wanted to do, but just knowing that if we talked about it and put it out in the world, to try to raise some awareness of HA or hypothalamic amenorrhea and REDS, then maybe something would happen. And something happened. We got a
I
lot of
love it.
response to that. Yeah.
That's incredible. And just to back up a little bit for everyone watching, I'm going to throw
Yeah.
some questions at you here. What's REDS? Why is menstrual health important? And why are we talking about this during Eating Disorder Awareness Week?
Yeah. RED stands for Relative Energy Deficiency in Sport. Folks maybe know the female athlete triad, which is not a term that is used very often anymore, but used to be pretty commonly thrown around. And eventually the female athlete triad was sort of folded into REDS to really account for the fact that REDS is multifaceted and can impact a lot of different systems in the body and also impacts athletes across sex and gender and does not just impact female athletes. So when we talk about REDS, we're talking about a state of low energy availability, which is basically a fancy way of saying that the athlete's not eating enough or is not nourished adequately to support their training or their activity level or just them as a human, right? We can have low energy availability as a person who is not an athlete, but when we are looking at this within athletics, we're looking at the athletes' fueling practices and habits and whether they're restricting intentionally through some disordered eating patterns or an eating disorder and or it's a lack of knowledge or a lack of support nutritionally and they don't really know how to fuel for their sport. And a lot of times there's overlap in all of those things. And when we look at REDS, we're looking at an impact on performance, an impact on immune health, an impact on reproductive health, an impact on digestive health, cardiovascular health. It has so many different areas that it
Yeah.
touches on for a body.
So all of the things.
All the things. Yeah.
Yeah. And I love that you mentioned specifically disordered eating as well as eating disorders, because I think a piece that doesn't get talked about enough is that it really is a spectrum, right? And for athletes, especially, I think it's easy to underfuel unintentionally, as well as the people who maybe are bringing some of the disordered eating patterns. But for I feel like there's this narrative that people are supposed to hit rock bottom before they get help. Like, oh, I went through all of these things, and then I hit my rock bottom, and that's when I turned around to get help. But I always wondered, like, what if you didn't? Like, what if you got help first, right? Like, what if you realized I'm having kind of a hard time? There are some red flags here. Maybe I should get help for that. Do you see a lot of people in that middle ground?
Yeah, so many of the stories that are shared through our platforms, you'll hear somebody say, it wasn't a full-blown eating disorder, or I didn't have a clinical eating disorder. And what they're
Yeah.
sharing, I think, is so relatable to people, and it like breaks my heart a little bit because what I want to say is that doesn't mean you didn't need support. And the person often who's joining us and sharing the story knows that. And I hope that the
Hmm.
person, whoever is listening on the other side, hears it and realizes I don't have to be struggling so much that I need to be hospitalized or be so sick that I can't get out of bed or, raise all these red flags. It can be that you're struggling with food, that you're struggling with body image, that you're struggling to get through some of the workouts, you're struggling to find joy in the sport again, and that all of these things are actually connected to each other. They're not separate. And I want
Hmm.
athletes to hear these stories and to be able to see themselves so that they can feel like they can reach out for support and not feel like, oh, isn't this something everyone's struggling with? Right. Which maybe on a certain team it could be. It's certainly a cultural factor in a lot of sports. But yes, disordered eating and eating disorders are very much on a spectrum. And sometimes, depending on what your sources of nutrition information are, or kind of your wellness sources are, it's sometimes hard to see them as disordered. It's easier to see them as quote unquote healthy or quote unquote disciplined. And for an athlete, like
Hmm.
there's so much that has to be structured and attempted to be controlled. And so it's easy to kind of get into that environment or get into a team culture where you feel like you're doing all the right things to be the best athlete you can be, but actually you're struggling. And it's okay to get support for that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of crossover between what makes a good athlete and what can fuel an eating disorder, with the perfectionism, the dedication to training. All of these things can have such incredible results for people who are passionate and putting in the work to be excellent at their sport, or even just really keep improving in their sport.
Yeah.
But without that balance, it goes overboard.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
yeah, can you talk more about the cultural aspect? Because I think that's something that's really important to dive into a little bit more. That on a team, if you're surrounded by people who maybe have the same, I guess, misinformation or lack of education as you do, it's harder to spot problems.
Yes, absolutely. And I also think I don't want to speak poorly of coaches too broadly. I know coaches have so much on their plate and they're doing so much work and they're supporting so many athletes, but we do see a lot of harmful norms that are perpetuated by coaches and support staff. A lot of times when we hear stories from athletes on our platform, we hear, well, my coach said this about my weight, or my coach said this about what to eat or what not to eat. And whether the intention was good or not, like it creates a disordered pattern in a lot of athletes. They kind of latch on to one piece of information and maybe take it a little bit too far, but not with malintent, right? They're trying to be the best they can be. They're in a high pressure, high expectation environment, especially if we're looking at someone who's going from high school athletics to collegiate athletics and maybe from collegiate to pro or to sub elite. Like there are so many changes that happen with each of those transitions that there is what we hear a lot is athletes who struggle to kind of find what's working best for them because they're just looking around and trying to see what's everyone else doing and how can I do what everyone else is doing to try to seem like a team player or seem like they're doing the best that they can to be high performing and high achieving without a lot of information about what that actually would look like. So, yeah, I think we see, a lot of team culture that sort of promotes or perpetuates restrictive eating. There are so many sports that have this aesthetic aspect to them where there is kind of this long held belief that a certain body type is right for that sport instead of welcoming the athlete themselves in the body that they're in and saying like, what can we do to
Mhm.
support you to be the best in this sport, whatever that might look like for you. And I think if we had more kind of individualized support for athletes and we had more folks who were kind of ready to support athletes in a way that felt like we want to support you and what that looks like for you, and not just like what does that look like for everyone, because there is no approach to nutrition or training or menstrual health that is going to work for everyone. Each person is so unique in what they need.
Yeah. And, we're talking about this from the lens of the running community, but this feels applicable to so many sports.
Yeah.
So I guess from both sides of this then, if you are a coach or someone who has a position of power in the athletic community, how can you be supportive of the folks on your team?
The first thing that comes to mind is kind of knowing what you don't know and being willing to bring in
Mhm.
people who can be supportive to your athletes. And then, of course, continuing to educate yourself as a coach. Like, I coach runners and I'm a dietitian, and I'm always learning new things. Like, I have been a dietitian for
Mhm.
15 years. And I'm still doing my continuing education every year, right? There's always more to learn. There are ways we can improve as clinicians and as coaches. And I think that again, like bringing in people that can fill the gaps in your knowledge, if you have the resources to do that by tapping into your community or tapping into your network, um, bringing resources to athletes who may be struggling, just kind of knowing where to refer them out. Again, knowing what you don't know and where
Mhm.
your scope is going ends and someone else begins, and they can help that athlete. Yeah, those are the things that come to mind immediately.
I love that. And
Yeah.
then what about on the athlete side? What can folks do to advocate for themselves if they have like a gut feeling that something isn't right or they're getting advice that just doesn't feel right for them?
Yeah, I think maybe, I mean, ideally they're working with a clinician, right? So ideally they're able to connect with a mental health professional and a nutrition professional, physical therapist if that's needed, a medical professional who understands
Mhm.
athletes and the unique needs of athletes, especially a menstruating athlete and what's normal and what's not normal for them. Ideally, we can really easily connect athletes with clinicians. But if that's not the first thing that's accessible or the first thing that someone feels ready to do, finding someone you feel comfortable talking to about it. Maybe that's a teammate, maybe
Mhm.
it's a friend, maybe it's a parent or a guardian or a mentor. Maybe it's one of us at Lane 9. Like, you can reach out to us. We would love to chat with you. I think just finding somewhere that you can say the things out loud and see how that feels and then get some support. I also think better understanding RED-S is going to be helpful to any athlete. Again, it's so multifaceted, it impacts so many different systems in the body. And what we'll sometimes hear is an athlete who will say something like, well, my cycles were a little bit irregular and I was also having a lot of digestive issues. I just don't know what was going on. And as a clinician, you're like, I have some ideas, I have some thoughts. Let me ask some questions and get some more clarity. So I think if athletes really better understood RED-S, and that's not necessarily on the athlete, there are so many places where in a sports system we could be introducing this education. And it's just not that widely available. There certainly are so many organizations now who are trying to do that work. And of course, we're one of them, and there are many others. But yeah, I think better understanding RED-S, starting to get curious about what feels normal versus what feels really kind of anxiety inducing or stress inducing for the athlete. If they're really worried about food, preoccupied with body image, they're noticing that they have different cycle symptoms than what was normal for them. Knowing what's normal for you is step one, I guess, being more aware of your body and your cycle.
Mhm.
And then again, just finding somebody that you can talk to. I feel like whether that's a clinician or if it feels better or more accessible to talk to a teammate or a friend or a mentor, starting there can be really important.
Yeah. Just making that connection, I think, helps. And to that point, one of the things that I think both of us put a lot of focus on as organizations, as people, is storytelling. And
Mhm.
so I want to pivot now and talk a little bit more about why that's so important and how we've seen it impact people.
Yeah, we have so many folks who come on the podcast or write an essay for us who will say, Well, when I was in high school or when I was in college or when I was on this team, we had a dietitian come talk to us, and I did not want to listen to what she had to say. And so, what I'm hearing is there are professionals, and I know I've been in this position where you come in and you have such great information, and the person is just not ready to hear it because it is a like
Mhm.
educational setting, right? It is like, I have all this knowledge, I'm going to give some knowledge to you. And I think as humans, what we really need is to be able to see ourselves in the story, in the situation, right? So if a clinician comes in and is saying like most athletes need these things, you don't hear I need these things. And I
Yeah.
think when athletes tune into our podcast or they find an essay, and I know this because we get responses that literally say like, that's me. They see themselves in these stories. And so we try to share stories that just have slightly different details. A lot of the big picture is the same, but the details are different. And we don't want folks to go too into detail with too many things that could potentially be harmful to someone
Yeah.
reading. But just to say, I was on this team and I was struggling with this performance anxiety, or I wasn't sleeping, or I kept thinking this about my body. And I think when the more stories we have, the more folks who are going to find them and see themselves in that. And of course, like when we share these stories, a lot of times it is kind of after the fact. And so part of the story is I got support, I asked for help, I talked to a coach, I talked to a teammate. And so it gives folks that kind of next step that they're looking for. And I just think it's
Mhm.
much more powerful if they are able to relate to the story or to see any part of themselves in the story that's being told. I think that's more powerful than having a clinician, much as I love to be a clinician, coming in and saying, like, this is what works for most people. They need to know what's going to really work for them.
I completely agree. And we do a lot of similar work on our end as well. And we have a whole storytelling series of people sharing their stories. And I really love your point about the people who are coming to us are often later on in their journey. So it
Yeah.
shows
Yeah.
tangible steps. And even in our groups, I lead one of our support groups, so I get to see it on kind of a smaller scale in there, people sharing just pieces of what's going on with them. And sometimes the only thing the group can say is like, I feel you, I've been there. I have felt that exact same thing. And even just that, the relief of knowing like I'm not alone. I'm not wrong for feeling this way. I'm not some unique, strange outlier.
Yeah.
That can be really, really powerful for people. Even if there's not a tangible next step, just knowing you're not alone and seeing yourself reflected in other people's experience is incredibly powerful.
Yeah, the most common response that we get to folks who stumble upon our blog, and these are a lot of times like really old posts that have been up for years, an athlete will find it and they'll email us directly and say, like, I read this post, I'm in this program, I'm this age, like, what do I do next? Who should I work with?
Wow.
And it's always really interesting to me that that person, like, resonated so deeply with what they found that they email us who they've never met before. We're not even really a face to them. It is an organization, right? And
Mhm.
are asking like, just just tell me what to do next. I just want to know what to do next. And I hope that part of what we can do is kind of reduce that mental load for folks who are struggling, who reach that stage where they are ready to ask for help, but there's a gap between like being ready to ask for help and really knowing what kind of help you need.
Yeah. And that takes some agency, right? To identify that, hey, there's something going on. I'm going to go out and do the research. And even
Yeah,
to get to the point of finding that post, like that's effort.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So
Wow.
I think, so much of what we do has revolved around storytelling. That was not initially our intention, but it was what happened so quickly was we individually shared our stories and wanted to represent like different levels of athletics. I was never a collegiate athlete. I didn't compete at a high level. I still run and enjoy it so much, but I'm not winning any races. I'm not coming first in my age group ever. It's just not the type of runner that I am. and was still impacted by all of these things, just being
Hmm.
adjacent to the sport and a fan of the sport and a follower of the sport. And again, we talk a lot about running, but insert any sport into that sentence. And then Alexis comes in and shares a collegiate athlete experience, which is much more of what we hear in our community. But we wanted to share that you don't have to be competing at a high level to be called an
Hmm.
athlete, to consider yourself an athlete. You have to be a person who participates in sports in some way and enjoys it, and it's a part of you and it's a part of your identity. And you want to be able to keep doing that thing. So, the way that we launched Lane 9 was by sharing those stories in a personal essay form. And we were so surprised by how many responses we got to that, just from people from her team, people from running groups that I've been in, people from just like different seasons of my life who were like, I want to share my story too. I want to write for Lane 9. I want to do an essay. I want to be on the podcast. Like wanting to, I guess, resonating with some piece of each of our stories and wanting to kind of pay it forward.
I love that. That's really amazing. And I love your focus on including people at different levels and different places in the sport. Like I found running as an adult and I actually found your podcast when I was looking for resources for myself because I was impacted too.
Yeah.
And I think that piece of it is another thing that isn't talked about enough and folks need some validation on that an athlete is really anyone who moves their body. Like how you do it, how quickly you do it, how well you do it, I
Hmm.
think is secondary.
Yeah.
And it's easy to think like, oh, I don't count because I'm not on a team, because I'm not fast enough, I haven't competed. But if it's having an impact,
Yeah.
it counts. You count, and it's worth getting help for that.
Yeah.
Before
And
you mentioned joy, like finding joy in sports, and that's something I've done a lot of work around, and I still love running. I ran yesterday, I'll run today, even though it's cold, because
yeah.
it really does bring me joy. And I
Yeah.
think that's an aspect that it isn't separate from being an athlete. I think it should be tied up.
Yeah. Most of the clinicians in our directory will share an intro when they join to the other clinicians and coaches who are in there. And we ask, like, what is your sport of choice or just sports that you love watching or following, And it's so fascinating to see the different answers. And a lot of times what you'll see is like, well, I played this sport as a kid and then I got into running as an adult. And part of what I keep thinking about in this season of life for myself is like, how do we get back to some of those sports that we played as kids? It's less accessible as an adult for the most part. It's harder to schedule, it's harder to join teams. It's very
Mm-hmm.
easy comparatively to put on shoes and go outside and go for a run or a walk or a hike or even a bike ride, right? Compared to like, I join this team and I go to the game at this time and we have practices on these days. And it's a lot more kind of structure that you have to try to fit into your life. But we also hear people say, and I've done this too, I played that sport as a kid, but I'm not good anymore. So that's why I don't do it. And I feel like
Mm.
what I hope we can continue to do through this work is to just kind of remind people like it's okay to enjoy a sport and not be good at it. It's okay to enjoy movement in any form, sports in any form, and just let it be fun and let it be giving in whatever ways it's giving for you and not be great at it and not be winning and not be like, excelling in all manners, just to like let yourself enjoy it.
I love that. And it's something I'm doing a lot right now. I'm in a season of life with young kids, one of whom has
Yes.
developed an interest in yoga. So we fall over together and it's the best. Like it is so much fun. Like
Yeah.
neither of us are hopping up doing any of the balances, but we watch and we try and we fall and we laugh.
Yeah. Yeah.
I yeah, just made me think of that.
I love it.
So I guess what would be your message to anyone watching who is thinking like I don't know if this is me. I don't know if I count. I don't know if I am an athlete.
Mm. I think if you move your body and you enjoy any sport and you participate it in any way, you can consider yourself an athlete. There's no one way to define an athlete. You don't have to be a professional. You don't have to have experienced it collegiately. You don't have to be good at it. You can just be a person who enjoys sports. And if that's a thing you want to continue to do, especially as an adult, there's some support that's required, and that's okay. It's okay to need to go to a PT. It's okay to consult with a dietitian. It's okay to get in touch with a therapist. All of these things, if it keeps you in the sport that you love and it keeps you doing movement that's important to you and that you value in any way for any reason, that's okay. We have this directory of clinicians. It's not just for collegiate athletes. It's not just for professional athletes. It's actually primarily for folks who want to be in sport in some way and know that they need support to keep doing it. If this is something that you want to be able to keep doing for a long time, our bodies are resilient, but they also need care. So it's okay
Yeah.
to ask for that help and to need that support.
And to kind of loop back around to what we touched on earlier, and a message I really want to like keep putting out into the world is again, you can reach out for support before a diagnosis, before something has gone catastrophically wrong. Like it's okay to get help for the sprained ankle instead of or along with the broken femur, right? To be
Yeah.
metaphorical there, but it it, it doesn't have to be as hard as it is. And it takes some self-advocacy, it takes some self-awareness, and it takes the willingness to ask, which is hard. Like I see that and I get it, but it's important.
Yeah, there is definitely a narrative thread through, I think, all sports and at all levels that discipline and hard work and sort of grinding it out are what makes you quote unquote good. But you really can't be good at anything if your body is falling apart in any way, your body or your
Mm-hmm.
brain. So again, if this is a sport or a movement that just feels important to you for any reason at all, getting support is part of what helps keep you active and keep you engaged in that
Mm-hmm.
part of your life.
And ANAD is here to support as well. In case anyone is just jumping on the thread and hasn't heard the spiel yet, we have support groups, we have a helpline, we have a mentorship program, and a directory as well. Although ours does not have athlete specific folks. So you can always check out Lane 9 for that one.
Yeah, we would love that. Yeah, we have our podcast, we have Instagram, we're at Lane 9 Project, lane9project.org if you want to get in touch. We'd love to chat with you and just point you in the right direction if you need a little help finding what you need.
Heather, I just want to thank you so much for jumping on today. Again, yours was a resource that helped me when I needed it, and I was really excited to be able to talk with you and put out some awareness during Eating Disorder Awareness Week.
Yeah, I love it. This is our, I think, sixth, seventh anniversary. I keep forgetting the years. We launched during Eating Disorder Awareness Week in 2017. Eighth? How many years has it been since 2017? I don't know. A lot of years.
Too many.
It was so many years. My math is not mathing. So yeah, Eating Disorder Awareness Week is definitely near and dear to us. It was when we decided to launch and kind of share our stories and put this out to the world. So grateful to you for reaching out and including us in your resources, and just happy to continue collaborating so we can support athletes.